There was a time when PlayStation didn't just want you to play their games, it wanted you to make them. LittleBigPlanet wasn't about high scores or hyper-realistic graphics. It was about cardboard worlds, messy creations, and millions of players learning game design without even realizing it. And yet, LittleBigPlanet 3, the biggest and most ambitious entry in the series, was also the last. So how did a game built entirely around creativity quietly become the end of one of PlayStation's most beloved franchises? For millions of players, it was their first taste of creativity in games, a place where failure was part of the fun and where sharing something broken was still worth celebrating. By the time LittleBigPlanet 3 released, the series had already changed the way players thought about what a console game could be. This was meant to be the ultimate version of that idea. More tools, more freedom, more possibilities than ever before, all credited to the new PlayStation 4 system it was launching on. And yet, LittleBigPlanet 3 wasn't remembered as a triumphant evolution, it was remembered as the end. Not because creativity disappeared in the game, but because the foundation beneath it began to crack. A new developer, a more complex vision, technical problems, and a community that had grown faster than the game itself could support. So today, we're looking back at LittleBigPlanet 3, what it tried to do, what it got right, what went wrong, and why the series, built entirely around imagination, quietly faded away from memory. This is the story of LittleBigPlanet's final chapter. Now, before we get into it, if you're familiar with my previous two retrospectives on LittleBigPlanet 1 and LittleBigPlanet 2, firstly, go and check them out if you haven't seen them already. And secondly, it's not going to be working the same as those videos. I'm not going to be ranking every level on a scale of low to high tier. I think I want to talk about the game more broadly and delve deeper into some things that I think are more important rather than just ranking the levels. But with that out of the way, let's get into starting with talking about the story. LittleBigPlanet 3 takes place in Bumcum, a world made up of multiple themed planets overseen by three powerful beings known as the Titans, who maintain balance across the world. The story centers on Newton, our main antagonist, a highly intelligent inventor who once lived in Bumcum. Newton believed creativity should be controlled, perfected, and managed through logic and machines. Because of this mindset, he was rejected by the Titans and cast out of the world of Bumcum. Years later, Newton returns determined to prove himself right. As Sackboy arrives, Newton launches his plan, and this kicks off the main narrative of LittleBigPlanet 3. He deploys a massive mechanical force across the world, capturing the Titans and using machines to drain Bumcum's creative energy. With the Titans imprisoned, the world begins to destabilize, and Sackboy is tasked with stopping Newton and restoring order. The player travels across Bumcum's different worlds, beginning in Uptown, which introduces Newton as the main threat. From there, the journey continues through worlds like Manglewood, a film-themed planet, and the Ziggurat, which focuses heavily on machinery and inventions, reflecting Newton's approach to creativity. Along the way, Sackboy is joined by three new playable characters: Oddsock, Toggle, and Swoop. Toggle can switch between heavy and light forms, Oddsock specializes in speed and wall running, and Swoop can fly and interact with objects from distance. Each character is introduced as part of the story and becomes essential to progressing through certain areas. Each one of them also adds much needed extra depth to LittleBigPlanet 3, which was severely lacking in the previous two installments. As Sackboy advances, Newton becomes more aggressive, directly confronting and taunting the player as his control over Bumcum begins to slip. Major story milestones are marked by the release of the Titans in a marble mechanic, where a marble is gained for each Titan released. In the final stages of the campaign, Sackboy confronts Newton in levels dominated by machinery and rigid systems, constricting the creativity of the world. Newton's plan ultimately fails, his machines are shut down, and the Titans are fully freed, and Bumcum is restored. Rather than being destroyed or punished, Newton is accepted back into Bumcum. The story ends by reinforcing the idea that creativity isn't something to be controlled or owned, but shared. And for me personally, I think this was one of the best narratives out of the 3 LittleBigPlanet games in the main series. It has a strong thematic messaging, a lot of depth which was much needed in its gameplay with the introduction of the 3 other characters, and similar to LittleBigPlanet 2 here, we have better voice acting.
Simple press of this button, our adventure will begin.
Which, as I discussed in my first LittleBigPlanet retrospective, we didn't have. And I do think that the blabbling and text boxes from LittleBigPlanet 1 do have charm, but I think it carries way more emotional weight and impact when the characters are actually talking to us, and helps me get way more invested in not only the story, but the characters that are in it. So with that all being said, a few other positive things I wanted to mention quickly include the greater gameplay variety. Levels regularly shift the mechanics and the pacing, which prevents the campaign from feeling repetitive and offers more distinct gameplay styles than previous entries, especially LittleBigPlanet 1, which shows how the game has been evolving. Another thing is the more complex puzzle designs. Many levels take advantage of multi-character mechanics, encouraging planning and coordination rather than just the simple platforming we've seen before. And then one of the major things is the backwards compatibility with the earlier content in LittleBigPlanet 1 and 2. It adds enormous value and reinforces the sense of a unified world of LittleBigPlanet, and further encourages that creativity that this game series is all about. Now, with the positives out the way, it's not all good news. There is a lot of things that LittleBigPlanet 3 does wrong. It was the last installment in this series for a reason, so it's not all positive. One of the most significant factors shaping LittleBigPlanet 3 is the change in developer. The first 2 mainline entries were developed by Media Molecule, the studio that created the franchise and defined its identity. But by the time LittleBigPlanet 3 entered development, Media Molecule had stepped away from the series, and developer Sumo Digital stepped in to handle it. Media Molecule had publicly expressed after LittleBigPlanet 2 they felt that the series had reached a creative endpoint for them and wanted to focus on other projects such as Dreams. Sony, however, wanted to continue the franchise, as LittleBigPlanet had become a recognizable PlayStation brand with an active online community and strong long-term platform value. And for Sony, they wanted it as one of the main titles releasing alongside the new PlayStation 4 console. This put LittleBigPlanet 3 in a difficult position. Sumo Digital inherited not only the franchise, but also its engine, creation tools, and millions of existing community levels. Maintaining backwards compatibility with LittleBigPlanet 1 and 2 was a priority for the team, which meant building on top of an already fragile and heavily modified foundation, which was becoming slowly unstable. Media Molecule's approach to design emphasized creative and unrestricted play. In LBP1, levels like the wilderness or the savannah often allowed players to solve challenges in multiple ways, dragging objects, breaking scenery, and using physics creatively, interacting with the environment around you. LBP2 also expanded on this, with levels such as Avalonia, which introduced logic systems but still encouraged experimentation. However, when we get to LittleBigPlanet 3, the design is far more scripted. Worlds like the Ziggurat are built almost entirely around specific mechanics, conveyor belts, switches, character abilities that must be used in a particular order to progress through the story. For example, many Ziggurat levels explicitly require Toggle's heavy form to activate pressure switches with no viable alternative solutions, taking the creativity away from the player in how they approach the story. The introduction of multiple playable characters further highlights this shift. As much as I previously said it added some much needed depth, it also took away from some important elements in the story the previous installments had. Oddsock's wall running and long jumps are frequently the only way to progress through certain Manglewood levels, while Swoop's grappling and object interactions are mandatory in airborne puzzle sections. Unlike earlier games, these abilities are rarely optional, reducing the sandbox-like feel of the previous installments. There is also a clear change in how the game teaches its systems to the player. In LittleBigPlanet 1 and 2, mechanics were often introduced through the level layout, for example the use of water physics or pistons, whereas in LittleBigPlanet 3, the game regularly pauses to explain mechanics through dialogue or on-screen prompts, particularly when introducing the new characters or tools, which takes away from that discovery that the player can organically experiment with as they progress. Narrative delivery reflects this same structural shift. Earlier entries relied heavily on environmental storytelling and minimal exposition. LittleBigPlanet 3 features significantly more spoken dialogue, with Newton frequently interrupting levels to explain his plans directly to the player or comment on their progression. This makes the story clearer for the average audience, but also more intrusive and less organic in the way it's told. Despite these differences, LittleBigPlanet 3 consistently shows respect for the series' core ideas. The visual style, the emphasis on community creation, and the ability to play older levels all reinforce that Sumo Digital understood what made the franchise special. However, by expanding the scope so dramatically, new characters, deeper logic systems, and larger levels, many of those ideas became harder to support. Sony's influence is also visible in the game's ambition. LittleBigPlanet 3 was designed as a launch window for the PlayStation 4 that could serve as a long-term platform. Features like cross-generation support and an expanded toolset reflect this goal, but they also increased complexity and strain on the underlying systems that were already established in LittleBigPlanet 1 and 2. The shift in philosophy didn't just affect the game's design, it had direct technical consequences. By building on a legacy engine, supporting old content, and layering new systems on top, LittleBigPlanet 3 became the most technically demanding entry in the series, and when the game finally released, those pressures became impossible to ignore. When the game launched in November 2014, its technical state immediately overshadowed almost every other aspect of the game. What should have been a celebratory release for a beloved PlayStation franchise quickly became defined by instability, broken systems, and a lot of player frustration. One of the most serious issues at launch was save data corruption, and personally I remember this happening to me multiple times. Many players reported losing hours and hours of gameplay, and in some cases entire playthroughs. I remember when I first got the game, and I had completed the whole of the campaign, had so many levels I had created in the creative mode, and one day I logged on to see all of my data had been lost and the whole game was corrupted. This left so many save files from players completely unusable. This was especially damaging in a game built around long-term progress, unlockables, and creative investment. For a series centered on player expression, losing creations and progress and everything players had built was the worst case scenario for the game. Online functionality was another major problem. LittleBigPlanet 3 launched with broken and unreliable online features, including difficulty connecting to servers, failed level uploads, and community levels refusing to load. Matchmaking was inconsistent, and co-op sessions frequently disconnected mid-level. Given that play, create, share slogan is the foundation of the franchise, these failures struck at the core of what LittleBigPlanet was meant to be. Performance issues were also widespread. Players encountered extremely long load times, frequent level restarts due to soft locks, characters becoming stuck in geometry, and physics objects behaving unpredictably. In some cases, levels would simply fail to complete, forcing players to quit and reload, assuming the save file wasn't lost in the process. Even basic progression could break. Some players were unable to unlock worlds, while others found collectibles failing to register. Tutorials occasionally failed to trigger, leaving players unable to progress without restarting the game entirely. Crucially, many of these problems weren't limited to edge cases. They were common enough that early reviews, forum discussions, and social media coverage focused less on the game's ideas and innovation and more on whether it's functional at all as a game. YouTube videos documenting glitches and crashes spread quickly, shaping public perception in the game's earliest and most crucial days. Sony and Sumo Digital did attempt to address these issues through post-launch patches, and over time, many of the most severe bugs were fixed. However, these fixes arrived gradually, often months after release, and by then much of the damage had already been done to the reputation of the game and Sumo Digital. For a community-driven game, first impressions matter more than usual. When players lose progress, can't connect online, or feel that their creations aren't safely being stored, trust erodes quickly. Many players simply moved on, and those who left early had little reason to return once the game stabilized. The end result is that LittleBigPlanet 3 became defined not by what it eventually became, but by what it was at launch. Even today, discussions around the game often begin with a disclaimer that it's better now than it was before when it first launched, a qualifier that no entry in a flagship series should need, especially LittleBigPlanet, which had almost a golden reputation before this third release. And I feel like all of these issues are what culminated in us not seeing a LittleBigPlanet 4 today, but I feel like it's also deeper than that. So let's look at why we still haven't got the next entry in this series, because despite all of this, LittleBigPlanet 3 still sold really well. The game shipped around 5.5 million units worldwide across the PlayStation 3 and 4. Based on typical prices for the games at the time, around $60 US, an estimated $330 million to $385 million was made with LittleBigPlanet 3. So the game was a financial success. So why didn't Sony pick the series up for a fourth installment? We've seen spin-offs recently like Sackboy's Great Adventure, but we're still yet to see Sony commit to a true sequel with LittleBigPlanet 4. And I think that the truth of it is the first major factor is the damage caused by LittleBigPlanet 3's launch. Despite selling really well, the game's technical state severely damaged trust in the franchise. For a series built around user-created content and online sharing, instability was uniquely harmful to this series. Losing save data, broken online features, and unreliable co-op undermined the very foundation of what LittleBigPlanet was meant to be from Sony's perspective. This made a direct sequel a far riskier proposition. By the time LBP3 released, the series had also become extremely complex on a technical level. The game was supporting years of legacy content, increasingly advanced creation tools, and online systems that had been built up across multiple console generations. A hypothetical LittleBigPlanet 4 would have required either a complete engine rebuild, risking backwards compatibility across the other games, or another layered expansion on top of an already fragile system. Neither option offered a clean or low risk path forward. There's also the question of creative leadership. Media Molecule, the original creators of LittleBigPlanet, had already moved on after the second game. Their focus shifted towards Dreams, which took the core ideas of user creativity and expanded it beyond platforming entirely. Without Media Molecule at the helm, any future of LittleBigPlanet would have faced the same challenges LittleBigPlanet 3 did, continuing a franchise deeply tied to its original vision without the studio that had helped define it. Sony's broader strategy was changing as well. During the late 2010s, Sony increasingly prioritized large cinematic single-player titles and carefully managed live service projects. LittleBigPlanet, by contrast, was expensive to maintain, difficult to onboard new players into, and heavily reliant on an engaged community. It no longer fit neatly into Sony's evolving portfolio with the PlayStation 4. Instead of continuing the series, Sony chose to preserve what was most recognizable, Sackboy himself, which was crucial to Sony at the time when the first game released, as they needed a mascot to rival Microsoft's brand identity with IPs such as Halo. This led to Sackboy: A Big Adventure, a more traditional platformer that kept the character alive while stripping away the technical and creative complexity of LittleBigPlanet's creation system. It was a safer and more controlled direction for the game, and taken together, these factors explain why LittleBigPlanet 4 never happened. The franchise didn't fail creatively, but it became too complicated and too risky for Sony at the time, and too out of step for the direction that the industry was heading in. Does this mean that in the future we'll never see a LittleBigPlanet 4? Well, in my opinion, I really hope not. I hope that we can see this series return, but I think in the near future it's very unlikely. We haven't heard anything about a potential fourth game yet, and I don't think we will anytime soon. But that doesn't mean it's never gonna happen. But switching back to LittleBigPlanet 3, once the technical issues were largely addressed, the game became the most fully featured entry in the series. Nowhere is that more obvious than in its creative mode, which we haven't really mentioned much. It represents the peak of what LittleBigPlanet's toolset ever allowed players to do out of the 3 games, building on the logic systems introduced in LittleBigPlanet 2 and significantly expanded here in LittleBigPlanet 3. Feels really intuitive. It has more advanced logic gates, refined microchip systems, and improved sensors, which gave creators greater control over how levels behaved and what they could create with them. This allowed the community members to create experiences that went far beyond traditional platforming, including full puzzle games, RPG-style progression systems, and competitive multiplayer modes, as well as so many franchise spin-offs that were made in LittleBigPlanet. I remember playing so many levels around Star Wars, Marvel, The Slender Man, and so many other IPs that made their way into LittleBigPlanet through this creative mode, and they're some of the levels I have the best and most prominent memories with. The editor itself also saw meaningful refinements. Object grouping, layer control, and tool organization were more robust than in the previous installments, making large-scale projects easier to manage. While this increased complexity raised the barrier to entry for the standard player, it also meant experienced creators could work faster and with far more precision than before. The introduction of new playable characters also had a far greater impact in the creative mode than in the campaign. Characters like Oddsock and Swoop enabled entirely new level concepts, such as speed-based challenges and vertical flight-focused stages. These were ideas that simply weren't possible in earlier entries. Visually, LittleBigPlanet 3 refined the series' look rather than reinventing it. Higher resolution assets, improved lighting, and better material details gave both official levels and community creations way more clarity, especially on the PlayStation 4. Crucially though, LittleBigPlanet 3 also retained backwards compatibility with levels from LittleBigPlanet 1 and 2. This ensured that over a decade of community-created content remained accessible effectively, turning LittleBigPlanet 3 into the definitive archive of the series. Looking back, LBP3 feels less like a failure and more like an overextension, a game that pushed the series further than its foundations could comfortably support, but one that ultimately delivered the most powerful creative tools the game series had ever had. And for that reason, I'm still thankful we got the game, as despite all of its drawbacks and all of the issues it had that Sumo Digital introduced, they still made, at the core, a great LittleBigPlanet game. But to properly understand this, it has to be viewed not in isolation, but as the endpoint of a franchise that steadily evolved across each entry. The original LittleBigPlanet established the foundations. LittleBigPlanet 2 marks the series' biggest creative loop, and LittleBigPlanet 3 inherited all of that ambition. Spin-offs like LittleBigPlanet Karting and PlayStation Vita demonstrated how adaptable the core ideas were, but they also hinted at a franchise searching for direction. Meanwhile, Media Molecule's eventual shift towards Dreams showed where the original creative philosophy was heading: fewer constraints, broader tools, and a fresh technical base. Viewed in this context, LittleBigPlanet 3 feels less like a misstep and more like accumulation. It gathered everything that the series had become, its creativity, its ambition, its complexity, into one final, overloaded package. It wasn't the clean evolution the series might have needed, or the happy ending that the series deserved and wanted, but it's what we got at the end of the day, and I'm still happy that we got it, because having said all of this, I have so many amazing memories with the game and the series in general, and it'll always be one of my favorites from my childhood. So for that, I say thank you. Thank you to LittleBigPlanet, to Sackboy, to the adventures we all had. And if you enjoyed this video, check out the previous 2 retrospectives on screen now. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.